I thought you said if we destroyed the brain, it'd die.
It worked in the movie!
Well, it ain't working now, Frank.
You mean the movie line?
Welcome to Hamburgers and Horror, the home of meat, monsters, and more brains. I'm Noah Hook, and today we're looking at Return of the Living Dead. This 1985 horror comedy follows the employees of a medical supply store that accidentally unleash a chemical capable of raising the dead. They team up with some local punks partying in a cemetery to take on the zombies who are dead set on eating their brains. So the Return of the Living Dead actually has a really interesting history and production. The bones of the script actually come from a novel of the same name by John Russo, who co-wrote Night of the Living Dead with George Romero. Russo and Romero parted ways after Night and actually spent years in court fighting over the film rights. Russo retained the rights to the Living Dead title and wanted to bring his story to the big screen, but the studio that bought the script really only bought it for the title. The Return of the Living Dead was written and directed by Dan O'Bannon, who has also written Dark Star, Alien, and Invaders from Mars. The film was originally going to be directed by Tobe Hooper, with O'Bannon just writing the screenplay, but Hooper eventually backed out and O'Bannon was offered the director's chair. He accepted on the condition that he could drastically change the tone of the film, and I think he succeeded at that. And to be clear for those who don't know, Return of the Living Dead is not a sequel to Night of the Living Dead. In this world, Night of the Living Dead is still a film, so it's actually pretty meta. The film has a pretty big ensemble cast, but some of the most important characters are played by Clu Gulager from Nightmare 2, James Karen from Poltergeist, Don Calfa from Weekend at Bernie's, Tom Matthews from Friday Part 6, Miguel Nunez Jr. from Friday Part 5, Linnea Quigley from Night of the Demons, and Beverly Randolph from Death House. The Tar Man was played by Alan Troutman, who would return for the second and fifth installments in the franchise. William Stout, an illustrator who has made concept designs for Conan, Dinosaur, and The Mist, was brought on as a production designer. His design for the Tar Man and other memorable zombies were based on the corpses of real mummies and bog bodies, as well as his love of comic books. Cinematography was done by Dillinger's Jules Brenner, and the film's soundtrack features a ton of rock, punk, and psychobilly music from bands like The Cramps and The Flesh Eaters. Return was a box office success, making $14 million off its $4 million budget, and it surprisingly did well with critics too. While it's filled with a bunch of familiar tropes, it plays off of them well and also introduces a lot of humor into the mix. It currently has a 91 and 71% on Rotten Tomatoes and is widely regarded as a cult classic. I want to thank my patron Uncle Pete for requesting Return of the Living Dead for me to review, and y'all should also check out Uncle Pete's channel. He does a series called Nails in the Coffin where he rates the kills in horror movies by how much of a fight the victims put up. It's a lot of fun, and I've linked his channel down below. I've seen Return a handful of times now and I always have a great time with it, so I'm excited to talk about it today. Y'all should send more paramedics because we're watching Return of the Living Dead. The movie opens South Park style as we hop over to Unita Medical Supply Store where we meet the owner Bert, manager Frank, and new employee Freddy. Bert heads home while Frank puts Freddy to work packing some dentally inclined skellies. Then he shows Freddy exciting features like bedpans, prosthetic body parts, split dogs, and a fresh cadaver. Their new shipment hasn't come in yet, so they've only got one body at the moment. Now we meet Freddy's punk friends, and all we need to know about them is that they want to party. His girlfriend Tina has to pick him up from work, and the whole crew decides to come along. Freddy asks Frank what the weirdest thing he's ever seen in the medical industry is, and Frank says there is one thing that takes the cake. He asks Freddy if he's seen Night of the Living Dead and proceeds to explain that it was based on a true story. He says that a military chemical called 2,4,5-trioxin spilled and breached a morgue, and it caused the corpses inside to jump around as though they were alive. The government threatened George Romero to change the details, and when Freddy asks how Frank knows all this, he says the army fucked up and shipped those bodies here. He says they're down in the basement, and the two dummies head down to take a look. The bodies have apparently been here for 14 years, and they are housed in these big military drums. Hello, handsome. Freddy asks if the drums ever leak, and Frank assures him that they're top-notch USA military equipment.
Corps of Engineers.
The boys pass out as the room fills with gas and the body inside starts to melt down. The gas flows through the vents into the cadaver fridge and the body indeed starts wiggling. We hop over to California as Colonel Glover arrives home and he informs the base that he'll be home all evening if they need to contact him. His wife complains about the military equipment being in their home, but Glover needs to be reachable 24/7 just in case some particular drums are ever found. The gang gets a ride from this angry boy named Suicide to Freddy's work, but they are 2 hours early for some reason and decide to fool around in the nearby cemetery. They break inside and begin to party, I guess. Freddy and Frank wake up feeling like shit and they think the body melted down to nothing. They head upstairs and hear the whining of a dog, but it's actually only half a one. Frank beats the poor thing before they hear a bigger problem trapped inside the fridge and they retreat to the office. Freddy suggests calling the cops or the army number on the drum, but Frank is worried this could hurt his very important reputation around town and decides to call Bert. This lovely lady named Trash asks her friend Spider if he ever thinks about death and all the awful ways one can die. Trash gets all hot and bothered by all this talk of death and begins to perform a strip routine in the graveyard. This is apparently a very normal occurrence as the group circles and cheers her on. Bert is pissed at Frank for messing with the drums and he decides they have to destroy any evidence to avoid getting in trouble. They question how to kill somebody that's already dead, and taking note from Night of the Living Dead, they believe they should aim for the brain. Bert hands Frank a pickaxe and has Freddy unlock the door, but the corpse makes a beeline straight for Bert. They manage to pin the zombie down and Bert grabs the pickaxe, but unfortunately headshots do not work like they do in the movies. Bert grabs a bone saw to chop off the zombie's head, but that just allows the body to run around freely. It bumbles around and knocks a bunch of shelves over before they manage to tie the corpse up, and the boys decide they need to destroy the body entirely to kill it. They consider acid as an option, but Bert remembers that an embalmer named Ernie works right across the street and he's got a big hot crematorium. They're not sure Ernie will be willing to help, but they have very few options and they decide to hack the body into pieces to make transport easier. The punks are still in the cemetery, and just to make editing more difficult, Trash has decided to stay naked for the entire movie. Suicide complains about being misunderstood, and Chuck and Casey spot Freddy from a distance but assume it isn't him. The boys head over to see Ernie, who is too busy listening to his World War II era German music to hear them. He nearly pops Bert with his Luger, and he explains that he is popping out the corpse's rigor mortis through muscular stimulation. Bert tells Ernie that he has a very big favor to ask, and he has the boys bring in the wiggling bagged body parts. They tell him they received a shipment of rabid weasels and they would like to burn them alive in his crematorium. Ernie suggests more human approaches like the animal shelter or even shooting them, but Bert says the only option is fire. They make Ernie make a vow of secrecy and they reveal a wiggly yellow arm that rips his pants. Tina heads through the cemetery to meet Freddy at work, but her rings obviously get no answer. Ernie agrees to let them use the crematorium under the condition that Bert owes him a big favor and he fires up the machine. He assures Bert that nothing will be left of the body parts and they load the pieces up to their fiery end. And the smoke from the crematorium floats up into the sky and proceeds to come back down in a thunderstorm. The rain has turned acidic and forces the crew back to Suicide's car, and Tina heads inside the warehouse. The punks wonder what is in the acid rain, and the cemetery soil slowly becomes saturated with it. The boys are happy to see the pieces are nothing but ash, but Frank and Freddy aren't feeling too good at this point. They've got headaches, fatigue, nausea, and the chills, and they finally explain that they breathed in a bunch of gas. Frank throws up outside and Ernie calls an ambulance, describing their ailment as poison. Suicide's car won't start, so they head to the warehouse and the dead have begun getting active. Tina explores the disheveled warehouse looking for Freddy and eventually makes her way down to the basement. She's looking over the empty drum when the handsome gentleman emerges from his hiding space. Tina runs but breaks through a step and the tar man follows as she hides inside a locker. He comes up with a very sophisticated plan to pry open the locker, but the punks arrive and hear Tina's screams. They get down to the basement just as the locker is opened, but the tar man gets the jump on suicide and chomps into his skull. He takes interest in the other brains nearby, but they run upstairs and bar the door. An ambulance arrives outside the crematorium, and the paramedics realize neither of them have blood pressure or a pulse, and their body temperature is 70 degrees. The gang runs back to the cemetery for some reason, and it's here they witness the dead rise from their graves. Tina, Scuzz, and Spider run in one direction while Chuck and Casey go a different way, and Trash just cowers in place before she is swarmed. The paramedics explain to Frank and Freddy that they technically aren't alive, and Ernie gets a knock on the door from Tina, Spider, and Scuzz. They tell him to lock the doors and windows because dead people are coming out of the ground, and the zombies chase Chuck and Casey back into the warehouse. The paramedics have gone outside to grab a stretcher, but hear the zombies screaming and try to call it in. The driver turns on the lights to find he is completely surrounded, and he is quickly yanked out and nommed on. His partner hears the commotion and comes back out, but quickly suffers the same fate. Tina explains what's going on to Bert, estimating that there may be 100 zombies, and Ernie realizes they need to call the police. Casey is also trying to call the cops, but they are interrupted by a corpse. The group plans to evacuate using the ambulance, and Tina is distraught when she sees Freddy. Ernie finds the abandoned ambulance along with a paramedic being munched on, but he's able to outrun the little corpse back inside. He tells everyone the paramedics are dead and tries to call the police, but the phone lines are conveniently dead. The zombies begin trying to break into the funeral home, and the group barricades the front door and starts fighting them off at the chapel. This zombie overhears the ambulance radio and gets a bright idea.
I'm in dispatch. Send more paramedics.
The group has boarded up every single window, but decide to hole up in the embalming room since it has steel shutters. Frank and Freddy are looking even worse, and Spider and Scuzz demand to know what's going on. Bert explains that these two released a military chemical and now the dead are alive, and Freddy says his muscles are stiffening up. Blood has begun pooling inside his body, and Ernie says it looks a lot like rigor mortis. A second ambulance arrives, but the paramedics are immediately swarmed, and the dead have begun knocking down some of the barricades. A lady zombie grabs a hold of Scuzz for that tasty brain, and Bert chops her in half as she kills him. They capture the half zombie and tie her down, as Ernie wants to understand what they're up against. The zombie communicates back to Ernie, and he asks why they want to eat their brains.
The pain of being dead.
Eating brains is the only way to make the pain stop, and Bert, Ernie, and Spider try to think of a way to kill these things. Meanwhile, I guess the zombies left enough of Trash intact for her to reanimate, and she kills this random homeless man outside the cemetery. Bert suggests locking Freddy and Frank in a different room to be safe, and despite Tina's hysterical refusal, the majority rules and they're moved to the chapel. Tina opts to stay with the dying men and is locked in with them, and hey, a police car has arrived. Maybe they'll fare better than the paramedics, or maybe not. The boys agree a run for the cars is dangerous, and Ernie points out an attic they can climb into if necessary. He also has a small amount of nitric acid that could come in handy. Freddy cries out in agony before dying in Tina's arms, but he quickly awakens and tries to eat her brains. Tina manages to fight Freddy off long enough for the others to come in and help, and Freddy nearly bites Bert as Frank makes a run for it. Spider smacks him with a sledge, and Ernie splashes his face with the acid before locking the door again, and they carry useless-ass Tina back to the embalming room. They only have a moment to collect themselves before Freddy starts breaking out, and they accidentally drop a pew on Ernie's foot. They decide their only chance at this point is to run for the cars, but Ernie reveals his foot is broken. Fucked up Freddy breaks out and starts blindly heading their way, and Bert and Spider plan to hop in a police car and pick up Ernie and Tina. The zombies quickly storm Bert and Spider, but they manage to fight them off and get into the cruiser. They rush up to the door, but there are just too many zombies to make the pickup work. Bert decides it's time to split despite Spider's arguments, and while Tina is devastated, Ernie believes Bert will send help for them. The zombies end up blocking their exit though, forcing them back to the warehouse. And the police car blows up, taking Bert and Frank's cars with it. Ernie and Tina head up into the attic as Freddy bursts in, and still human Frank decides to end it for himself in the furnace. Frank, you are a moron, but that was honestly the most generous thing you could do. Meanwhile, the cops are being absolutely devastated by this zombie battalion. A police helicopter is circling the area, but the only phone to contact it is down in the basement. Freddy can smell their live brains from below, and he tries to guilt trip Tina into coming down. He manages to set up the ladder and starts pounding on the hatch, and it seems Ernie is considering a different way for this to end. The group opens up the door for the tar man, but Bert straight up knocks his block off. He calls into the police, but before they can offer any assistance, they are set upon by a mob of zombies, including zombie trash. Bert decides to call the number on the drum, and he is transferred to Colonel Glover. The Colonel receives a bunch of details on what is going on, including the approximate area that could be infected. Glover contacts the superior and explains the drums have been opened, and another general tells Bert they have a plan in case this kind of thing happens. Well, as you may have guessed, this plan is to blow up all the zombies in a nuclear fireball. The army launches the bomb just as Freddy breaks in, and the zombies watch as it descends and blows the area to smithereens. The bomb killed around 4,000 people, which Glover considers a necessary sacrifice. Little does he know that the fires and incoming thunderstorms are about to make the zombie outbreak a national event. There are already reports of acid rain, but everything should be fine in the morning, right, Mr. Skeleton? And that's Return of the Living Dead. It's an absolute hoot. The characters have a great range of being really dry to being really over the top, and they all bring a lot of really chaotic energy. I cannot think of a singular movie that has more people just screaming at the top of their lungs, often at the same time as each other. The punks aren't especially well-rounded characters, but they are all very distinct and memorable. Linnea Quigley's performance is truly bizarre, but I mean that in the best way possible. There were actually a lot of onset issues with her nude graveyard dance, and she had to wear a smooth prosthetic over her vagina. The more you know. One thing I had never picked up on in the movie but was really surprised to learn while researching it is that Ernie is low-key a Nazi. He listens to World War II German music, he has an Eva Braun pinup, he's got the Luger, and he considered suicide as he was being closed in on. Not to mention his profession. It was a weird discovery for me because I felt Ernie was one of the most human characters in the film, but I guess it goes to show that evil can hide in the everyday. The zombies themselves are some of my favorites ever put to screen, they just have so much personality. The Tar Man is easily in the top 10 coolest zombies of all time, his look is just so unique. Alan Troutman brings a fantastic physical performance to the creature. And let's not forget that this is the film that created the brain-eating trope, which is one of the most well-known things about zombies in popular culture. Every time I watch Return, I can't help but saying brains for like the following week. It's just so catchy. It's also important to remember that this was pretty early for horror comedies, so it was really breaking a lot of new ground. This actually came out the same year as another one of my favorites, Reanimator, so '85 was a really good year for zombie comedies. Not to mention, this was released the same year as Romero's Day of the Dead. Both are very nihilistic films, and while Day of the Dead had a much larger audience, Return of the Living Dead was actually received better by general audiences because it was able to have more fun with the nihilistic, anti-establishment themes in both films. I love the humor here, but I can also see why it wouldn't work for everyone. If you only like highbrow, well-polished horror and you avoid B-movies and low-budget affairs, this is probably one for you to skip. But if you love dry humor, great physical comedy, absurd practical effects, and grown men screaming like babies, Return of the Living Dead is definitely up your alley. The fact that the dead are eating brains to ease the pain of death is such a funny explanation. I am a bit disappointed in the ending, mostly because it's just a bunch of freeze frames and reused footage from earlier. I just feel like there was a missed opportunity for more melting zombie effects or a big fire stunt or something, but it doesn't detract from my overall enjoyment of the film. Overall, The Return of the Living Dead is a hilarious, nihilistic, over-the-top zombie movie that simultaneously parodies the genre while adding a ton to it. It has great characters, great humor, great music, and most importantly, great zombies. I'd say it's essential viewing for any die-hard horror fans, and it's definitely in my top 10 favorite zombie movies, as well as my top 10 favorite horror comedies. Thank you again to my patron Uncle Pete for requesting Return of the Living Dead for me to review, and be sure to check out his channel down below. Well, that's about it. Return of the Living Dead had a bunch of sequels, but I won't be covering those anytime soon. After all, we're still going through the Hannibal Lecter franchise. Join me in 2 weeks as we check out 2001's Hannibal. Thank you all for joining me, and an extra thank you to my patrons. As always, I'm Noah Hook, and thanks for watching Hamburgers and Horror. Stay safe out there. Thanks for watching my review of Return of the Living Dead. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe so you can keep up with all my horror reviews. And if you want to help support the channel further, you should check out my Patreon account. You'll be able to vote for future movies and franchises I cover on the channel. Thanks y'all.